Stephen Nunoda is a Calgary-based multidisciplinary artist whose practice takes the form of long-term, thematically interrelated research projects. His work is physically and aesthetically diverse, acquiring form to suit his subjects. He employs a variety of media, including miniatures, wood carving, found objects, photography, digital imaging, text, and time-based strategies. His work explores questions of family life, culture and place, memory, and identity. Steve received a BFA from the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, and an MFA from the University of Calgary. Currently, he is the workshop technician in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Calgary. His ongoing Ghost Town project, which he will speak about today, is an extended suite of works that started in 2012. Elements of the project have recently appeared in solo exhibitions at the Founders Gallery of the University of Calgary at the Military Museums in 2020, and at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto as part of the group exhibition Being Japanese Canadian, Reflections on a Broken World in 2019. Ghost Town was also included in the exhibition Inheritance, curated by Lindsay Sharman and myself at the Art Gallery of Alberta, which also featured works by Deanna Bowen, Adrian Stimson, and A.A. Bronson, which recently closed at the AGA a few weeks ago. It was my great pleasure to work with Steve on the exhibition at the AGA and also to welcome him here today for this virtual talk about his work. So thank you, Steve, and welcome to our online AGA platform.
I'd like to actually make a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from the University of Calgary, which is located on the Treaty 7 lands, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I guess what I'll do is jump right in with my PowerPoint presentation. And I'm looking forward to any comments or questions that you have at the end. So without further ado, I'll try to share my screen. So there, I'm hoping that that's working. Does that seem okay? Right. Hey, well, thanks to you all for coming. The presentation is entitled Ghost Town, the same as my installation and the suite of works which Catherine mentioned. I was very pleased to be included in Inheritance. It was a wonderful context for my work. It was a real privilege to be included with Deanna Bowen, with Adrian Stimson, and A.A. Bronson in an exhibition that deals so eloquently with things that are close to my heart, racism, family and community histories, and the sort of lasting effects on the people who follow on. So this is the title that I've been using for years, and I've sort of changed my mind about it. This is what I usually call my artist talks, representing personal solutions to expressive problems. I have to say that the work in the exhibition, which started 10 years ago, was very difficult to approach for me. It deals with my own family history and the Japanese-Canadian internment during World War II, or more correctly, the Japanese-Canadians' expulsion from the coast, their detention, and their subsequent dispersal across Canada. These are topics that were and are extremely fraught for me personally, and they were problematic for me as an artist for a variety of reasons. As you'll see, my work has not always been overtly political, and it took me a long time to deal with this content with something other than anger, with rage. So to do justice to the content and keep it relevant, I felt I needed to do something that would hopefully engage with the viewers in a meaningful dialogue, something more poetic. So as it turns out, this work has had considerable legs and has transformed with each showing. So I'd like to share with you how I got to the iteration at the AGA, a bit about my research, and a bit about some of my earlier work. So here's a better title, how I figured out a way to say things that I felt I needed to say without yelling. So this is a photograph by Charles Cousins of the work at the AGA. It's an installation of 368 miniature shacks that are die cut from tar paper and hand assembled. So Ghost Town is the name of the shack installation and the project suite that deals with the internment. Now, the term ghost town actually comes from my own family's usage. In my grandparents' generation, it was a term referring to the internment experience, not just the place where it happened, but the overall experience. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So at the back of the installation, you'll also see a second piece, which is called Ladder to the Moon. Now, it's hand-planed Douglas fir ladder. It tapers to a height of about 10 feet. And on the top is a paper mache sphere made out of mulberry paper. So that's the paper that's used commonly for calligraphy, brush calligraphy, and for brush painting. So a video of the phases of the moon is projected onto the sphere. And it stands as a sort of a sentinel or timekeeper, kind of a big grandfather clock of sorts. The form comes from two different family anecdotes. One from my father, who, when he was a young man in the camps, was taken in a stake truck overnight to an adjoining valley to pick fruit. And to do so, he would be standing on an orchard ladder, which, if you're familiar with them, they taper in much the same way as the ladder in the piece. The second anecdote is from my daughter, who, when she was very little, at one point asked me if I could build a ladder tall enough so that she could touch the moon. So for me, it's always been a figure of not only the labor that you have to do, but also of aspirations and hope. Well, there's also a connection with a 19th century saying for something which is impossible. So building a ladder to the moon is something like building a transcontinental railway, or basically something which is very difficult to do. And once you do it, opens up an entire world of possibilities. There's also, I realized later, a reference to a very famous Georgia O'Keeffe painting. So the video that's projected goes through the 29.5-day lean cycle of the moon in 29 minutes and 30 seconds, or a day per minute. So it moves almost imperceptibly. The video was built from an Apollo era moon globe, which was given to me as a child. I made it into a bump map in Cinema 4D and rotated a light so that it would go through the various phases. So back to the ghost town shacks. They're scale models of the 1 and 2 family standard shacks that were used for housing the interned Japanese Canadians in BC during World War II. So the layout is basically compressed, but it's very similar to what was used to organize the camps. So for anyone who visited the show, if you took a look at the area that the installation occupied, it's about 1/4 of the space of one of the small shacks. So if you look at the left-hand corner in the foreground, that's a single family shack. You could have put 4 of them into the room where Ghost Town was exhibited. And every one of them is just a little bit different, right? So the manner in which we install these is fairly intensive. A crew of people, and this is at the Founders Gallery, this is 10 friends and family, sitting at tables for approximately 3 to 5 days, assembling little shacks and laying them out on the floor. So I have to, at this point, give my thanks to the AGA prep team. So many of them helped me out doing this. So here's a little bit about my older work. I've long been interested in installation. In fact, I've been doing this since I was in second year of my undergrad. This is one of the older pieces in my catalog. It's called Mercator's Projection of the Mind. It was an installation at the Stride Gallery in Calgary. The theme here was actually had to do with perception and understanding. And what it involves is a map on the floor that's projected through a steel sheet, a little hole in a steel sheet. The map on the floor is actually it's a Mercator's projection of a brain map. So it includes all of the usual distortions of proportions that we're used to when looking at a world map. It's centered around the language centers. So the plumb bob that you see on the right-hand side of the screen hangs over top of the language centers that allow us to interpret or produce language. Later on, actually, I started to deal with, for the first time, overtly Japanese content. And I have to say that this installation, which was curated by Christine Sowiak at the Nickel Museum, was the first time that I'd done this. It comes from a question that was posed during my MFA defense by Professor Arthur Nishimura, who asked me during the open question period, what influence does Japanese art and culture have on your work? That was a pretty pointed question, and it's just lucky that it was in the open session. So, you know, my being flustered didn't fail me. My entire MFA defense had to do with the relationship of my work to the European tradition. I hadn't really considered how Japanese aesthetics or Japanese art influenced what I was doing. So with this show, it was the first time that I really started to look into it, looking into little turns of phrase that I remembered from speaking to my grandparents, looking at things that I'd always been interested in, one of which was Japanese gardening. So the term invisible waterfall is a badly translated phrase from Japanese garden for a rock arrangement, or gardening for a rock arrangement that suggests a stream flowing over the rock face. So in my version of it, what you're seeing here are 3 steel bars cutting across a corner of the gallery, with the top one holding an uncut roll of copy paper that runs through a paper shredder at the bottom. So on the first day of the installation, I actually ran the paper through to create the foam at the bottom. So here's a little close-up of that. On the floor was a projection of a water pattern through 2 home-built gobo machines, special effects projectors. So this next work was included in a show curated by Catherine Croston called the Alien Project at the former Edmonton Art Gallery. So this piece had to do with some of my obsessions with truth or hearsay, you could say. What I did was I combed through records of the shapes of UFOs and pulled out a few typical forms. And these I made into actual models that were turned on the lathe out of medium density fiberboard and then spray painted with an aeronautical paint to make them silver. So that's what you're seeing on the lower part. On the upper part, what I have are a series of descriptions that appear to come from something like a bird watching book. So what you would see is a photoshopped version of the illustration for each one of the species of flying saucer. And below it would be a text that described its physical features and what its call sounded like. So the sounds that it would make. A little bit tongue-in-cheek. So here's a close-up of the skipper. Later on, I became interested in this idea of memory and how it was constructed and how it contributed to our sense of personal identity. And through this, I started working on a piece called The Amnesia Cases, which I intend to continue working on. There are 72 possible cases, but I've only done a dozen or so. So I've got my work cut out for me. What you see here are actually two of the main cases on the right-hand side, which are card catalogs that include anecdotes and descriptions of various contents. So like a library catalog used to be. So they look something like this. So each one of them is cross-referenced with several other cards and several other cases. For vitrine, this is actually the interior, which was taken from Dutch masters' paintings of interiors, particularly a specific Vermeer for the floor. So what these are actually boxes that are lit from outside. They're scale models on the interiors of various spaces, none of which are occupied. I was interested in the notion that if you put a figure into this space, it would lock down the meaning, and it would in some way prevent the viewer from projecting himself into the space. What I used for many of the models were places where I had lived. So they had a kind of connection between my personal identity and place. So here's one. That's an apartment that I used to live in downtown Calgary. And here's another looking down the basement steps of a house I used to live in. So this is one of the ways in which I explore ideas. I often work in miniature because these are massive projects, and it seems like I'll never ever get them done if I don't make them a specific size. So I'm interested in the large scale installations and these miniatures. My method almost always begins with some form of research into an idea that catches my fancy. So one of them that was connected with the Ghost Town project was the idea of Japanese bridges. Now, bridges have always had around them the notion of a metaphor for change in state, a passage from one physical place to another, sort of a liminal space. Now, the interesting thing that I found is when you do a Google search for Japanese bridge, the first thing that comes up is Monet. So here we go. Now, Monet was, in fact, so interested in Japanese woodcuts and had quite an extensive collection of them. So on the left, you can see Hiroshige, which is from Monet's collection, and it's an image of a bridge. He was so enamored with these constructed landscapes that at his gardens in Giverny, he actually built a Japanese bridge using more or less the methods of Japanese carpenters and certainly the design that they would use to produce a bridge. Traditionally, a lot of these footbridges are made so that they're an arc segment, right? So a section out of a circle. And you can see when in the two images of Monet that it does, in fact, inscribe part of a perfect circle. When I started to look a little further, I wanted to see what was at Giverny today, since they've done an extensive renovation of the gardens, sort of a living museum. And this is what I came up with. Now, comparing the Wisteria Bridge, which features so prominently in so many of Monet's paintings, with the archival photograph on the left, you can see that they look a little bit different. And in fact, the more photographs that I looked at, the more I realized that they were certainly not exactly the same. Although the current Wisteria Bridge, which is touted as an exact replica. But if you look at them and you do a little bit of analysis, you can see that it's no longer the perfect arc segment. In fact, it's a sort of flattened parabola. They've literally flattened the curve. Now, I understand why they would do that. It's much safer for visitors to try and walk across this thing. But it does bring up the question of, all of the people who go to the gardens at Giverny hoping that they'll be able to capture in paint what the master did. And all of the paintings of the Wisteria Bridge are essentially wrong. So what I began to be interested in is this notion that around this metaphor, there's a little bit of sliding of meaning. There's a sort of a uncertainty when it comes to what is true, what is a model, what is the original, what is the meaning. So one of the things that I did with my research was to build this this shadow box, and I have a series of these. There are about 4 of them now. This one is called Pont Japonais, and you can see on the left-hand side, it's a sort of a traditional craft to build things out of hand-cut strips or sticks, architectural features, and in both in Japan, Korea, and China, this is a fairly well-established craft, beginning sometime in the 1700s, I believe, possibly earlier. So I built a replica of Monet's bridge for my own piece. Now, the 2 abutments that you see there are 2 pieces of wood that are leftovers from the right-hand side production. So what you see on the right are a series of chairs, one for each person in my family, cut from a single block of wood, a single stick of wood. The bridge abutments are the pieces that come from in between. And yeah, they're saw cut and finished. What I'm quite interested in is the sort of meaning of the materials and the process. So I tried to bring some sort of a conceptual connection between how it's made, what it's made of, and what it's meant to reference. A really good example of this is this piece called Blackbirds, part of the same series, also part of the Ghost Town series. So what you see here is a box that's about 4 feet long, and on the interior are a series of sticks. Now, those are bamboo skewers, the kind that you expect from an Oriental grocery store. And mounted on each one of the skewers is a miniature bird. Now, these are micro miniature carvings of crows done in maple. So I'm using materials that are native to 2 different continents. They refer to 2 different cultural contexts. There's a little bit of a close-up. So these small boxes or modest-sized miniature pieces are a way that I use to work through ideas. Now, one of the things that I was most interested in was how Japanese imagery comes into my circle of understanding or the Western culture in which I live. And the one piece which is recognized by everyone is this one, which is Under the Wave off Kanagawa by Hokusai, right, done in 1831. Marvelous piece, extremely powerful. It's lampooned, it's used in all sorts of cartoons. I've seen a Godzilla version of it. I've seen a ramen version of it. So this is an image that's everywhere. It always speaks about the power of circumstances beyond your control, of nature versus the puny humans in the foreground. One way in which I understand things is through the formal means that are employed in producing a piece. This isn't just an image, it's also a composition that carries a lot of power. There's almost a fist-like or hand-like motion from left to right with the wave. What I wanted to look at was, how could I actually incorporate that kind of a composition, an asymmetrical composition? So what I did was I analyzed it. In order to slow down the movement so I could understand it a little bit better, I stretched it out. And then I broke it into its various sections. So what you're seeing are registers of the composition through a compositional analysis. This would form the basis of my own composition for a long box. And what I ended up with was this. Right, so this is a piece called The Great Wave. Now, it comes from not only that composition, but from a couple of other sources. For people in my generation, we're experiencing a situation where we begin to have to clear out our parents' houses. It's a difficult and crushing sort of activity to go through. It's something which I've actually been participating in several times. I've cleared out my own parents' place. I've helped other friends clear out their places. On one occasion, a good friend of mine asked that I help out with clearing his parents' place. And in the basement were a whole series of storage shelves, and the storage shelves all contained not materials for everyday use, but things which had been stored away for use eventually. So when so and so retired, they would be engaging in this craft or this pastime. And so all those materials were stockpiled in the basement. There were containers to be used for when friends came over, when there was an occasion, and there would be some kind of entertaining going on. But there was shelf after shelf after shelf of these materials, and what we needed to do was to go through them for a garage sale. It was a hugely daunting task, but of course it's something which has to be done. And so that's where these forms came from. They're tiny laser cut models that are hand assembled and then arranged in this way, using that composition from the Great Wave. One thing that's happened, ironically, is that it has been damaged in transport, and so I'm still in the throes of reconstructing this piece. So it'll be rebuilt someday soon, hopefully. And one of the things that I noticed as I was working on this is that there was a secondary reference. You may recall this image from the 2012 tsunami. It became something of a shrine. This was the Disaster Management Center at Inami. And its legend is that the civil defense workers who were coordinating evacuation of the town stayed in this building until the wave came and literally washed them away. And so this has been preserved since then. I'm not sure what's happening with it today, but the plans were that it was going to be preserved for posterity. It's a very strange thing that we use this sort of modernist cube shape with rectilinear construction over and over again for so many things. So there's a close-up of the interior of that box. So moving on to Ghost Town again, I'd like to show you some of the research that went into this piece that kickstarted it. So a bit about family history and a bit about the Japanese-Canadian internment along the way. So for those of you who visited the show, you would have seen this image as you entered the section with the Ghost Town piece. And it's actually a blow up of my grandfather's identification card, where he was identified not as a landed immigrant, but as a Japanese national. So this is the old fella. I remember him, of course, much older, and it was startling to me when I found this to realize that he was about my age when this was taken. It really sets you back to think, what would you do if your livelihood was taken away, if your family was gathered up and you were incarcerated? It's stunning and really difficult to imagine or understand what he went through. And then on the backside, the backside is his physical attributes. He's not a very tall person, and I had no idea that he had a scar below his left ear. So this is him in happier days outside of his business. He was a baker in Powell Street in Vancouver, and these were the folks who worked with him or worked for him. So in March of 1942, after Pearl Harbor, the notices went out that everyone had to register who was of Japanese racial origin. And within a few weeks, basically by summertime, everyone had to move away from the coast. So you can see there's a listing there of all of the prohibited zones. Essentially, everyone would have to move at least 200 miles away from the coast. So from the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center at New Denver, BC, I've always felt that this is a really good summation of the numbers involved. So the internment itself lasted from 42 to 1946, so considerably after the war. At the end of that period, there was an attempt made to repatriate all persons of Japanese heritage to war-torn Japan. In other words, rather than resettling or allowing them to return to BC, there was a movement afoot to send them back to Japan, which had just lost the war. Now, a number of people actually did go. They certainly weren't welcome. These are people. The children certainly had been growing up outside of Japan. They weren't considered to be desirable or even fully Japanese by some. So this is one of the images that was in my grandfather's possession. These are buddies of his at part of the camp crew who built Popoff Camp. So he's, I think, the person who's taking the picture. So the camps were built hastily by a Japanese Canadian crews through the spring and summer of 1942. Now, some of the locations for the internment camps in BC were actual ghost towns. So this is an overhead view of Sandon from, again, the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center archives. Now, this was a rundown, basically abandoned silver mining facility. So it was quickly renovated so that people could live there. The majority of the camps, though, were purpose-built. And this is the one where my father's family were interned. In fact, if you count up from the bottom in the first row closest to the street, they're in the second row in the second shack back. Now, my grandfather actually was in Popoff for the entire war. He was there when the camp was built because he was one of the camp cooks. One of the first camps that was built is actually Tashme, and so this is an image from Tashme Camp. If you're wondering where that word comes from, it's actually an acronym. It stands for Taylor, Shiras, and Meade, who are the three leaders of the BC Security Commission. It does make you wonder what kind of person names an internment camp after themselves. Now, Tashme Camp was a little bit different from some of the others. As the first one built, it actually had a bit of barbed wire around it, and it had a guard tower, which you can see. They realized that the rest of the camps were so isolated that if you ran away from one, chances are you just die of exposure. You're in the middle of nowhere. But the middle of nowhere is sometimes quite beautiful. This is the Slocad Lake at Rosebury, which is the first place that my mother's family was interned at. I feel as though the camp was basically right on the shore. So the vantage point here was probably pretty close by to where the shack was that my mother's family was inhabiting. There's not much left there. In fact, most of the camps have disappeared. They were bulldozed in 1947. So again, from Roseberry, this is a foundation that's left over of a bathhouse that was built by the internees, probably around 1943. One of the few places that you can go and actually see the shacks is actually New Denver, BC. So that's where the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center is. And in 2011, I believe, Mark Hutchinson and I, a good friend of mine, went to New Denver to take measurements and photograph the remaining shacks. So this is the beginning of the interpretive center. This is their main shack, and it is actually set up as though it was a 1942 shack. So from the beginning of the internment, you can see what it is a simple place built out of timbers with clapboards on the outside, just like that. Now, unfortunately, they were built out of green lumber. And the winter of 1942 to 1943 was particularly severe, as you can see from the image here. The shacks were heated by potbelly stoves. And what with the green lumber, what began to happen was cracks appeared in the walls. And you can see that one inside the shack is about 1/2 an inch or 3/4 of an inch wide. So the wind would blow through these walls into the interiors. And that's where the tar paper from my shacks comes from. The story goes that my grandfather on my mom's side actually got a hold of some tar paper from one of the shipments for the camp. A number of people did this. And because the snow was so high on the outside for that first winter, he put it up on the inside. So you can imagine what that was like with the blackness and the smell of tar. What I began to be interested in was these anecdotes from my relatives. And I realized after my grandparents had passed that I really didn't have that much time to gather those up for my own information and not just as grist for the mill for making this body of work. So I started asking my relatives for their stories. I asked my mom in particular what she remembered. And one of the things that she mentioned was, you see that sled that's there. That wasn't for play necessarily. There were a number of these that were built out of packing crates, and everybody needed one. My mom remembers in the dead of winter having to take buckets of water from the pump back to the shack. And she recalls at one point, as she was pulling her sled, the water was spilling out, getting onto the runners and sticking that sled to the snow. And as she pulled it, she dumped most of the water out. When she got back, my grandmother just sent her straight back out again. So this is a 10-year-old's job, is to get the water to make dinner, to make rice. So the piece that ended up coming from this is called Rice Sled. So it has a soundtrack of a young person trying to haul a heavy load through the snow. It's an antique sled sitting on a pool of rice with buckets of water. So from the measurements that we did at New Denver, we did measured drawings, and that became another point at which I could ask relatives, okay, what was it like inside of there? Where was the bed? Where were the sinks? Now these were standard shacks, but none of the original blueprints exist. I went looking for them in the BC archives and the UBC archives, and they're just not around anymore. But some of the original shacks are, and they've been turned into holiday cottages, which is great. This is a cottage in New Denver. So one of the first pieces from the Ghost Town suite that I built was this one called the Roseberry Single, and it's a scale model of the shack inhabited by my grandparents. So if you get up close to it, you can hear the sound of my mother washing rice. So to build these tar paper shacks, I had them actually die cut out of tar paper. Now, there's not too many places that can still do this. This was done by the folks at Western Paper Box in Winnipeg, Manitoba. They were established in 1921. A lot of their equipment comes from that era. So they took my digital drawings and turned them into actual paper cutting dies and ran them through ancient machinery to produce something that looks like this. So this is what the shacks look like up close. Each one is hand built, and it's up to the person who builds it how well they build it, and whether the door is open or closed. And so each one is slightly different. So just as I'm sort of finishing off here, I wanted to show you a couple of other iterations, a couple of other versions of Ghost Town, because I've been showing this work for about 10 years now, and it's different every time. So the first time was actually at the old Stride Gallery again. The context was set up by a terrific interpretive article by my friend Diana Sherlock. You can actually get a hold of that article from the Stride website. It's still posted, I believe. And so that's the show, and you can see a better version of the ladder to the moon in the background. This is the fewest number of shacks that I've ever shown. So very narrow space. So later on, it was shown again and again. So Ladder to the Moon is here at My Winnipeg, the Artist's Choice. It's a plug-in ICI in Winnipeg when I was living there. And later on, I got the chance to take it back to BC. And this was a very interesting experience for me. I took it to the Nike National Museum, which is in Burnaby, BC. And we did the installation without the ladder, but with the projection, which I thought was a really very effective way of getting around the problem that the ladder wouldn't fit into the gallery. It was too tall. At the same time, I went up to New Denver and returned to the internment site. Later in the internment, actually, my mother's family moved to New Denver. So we put this up in the Cohan Memorial Gardens in New Denver, BC, with a crew of community members, not just people from the gallery, but actual community volunteers. Now, New Denver is one of the few places where Japanese Canadian families were allowed to stay in BC, and they actually stayed at their internment site. Largely, it was families who had people who had TB and were not movable, had to stay in the sanatorium that was established at New Denver. So there are still Japanese Canadian families from the wartime living there. So what we do is we put the shacks together in a kind of communal B. And I've begun to think that this is sort of an integral part of the project. It's sort of a relational kind of event in each show that involves, like direct discussions with the people who are helping to build the installation. It's sort of a direct participation of some audience members. So in the past, usually it was artists and student volunteers, or I hate to say it, I've tapped my family members umpteen times to do this. In New Denver, though, it was people from all over the community and tourists. And it also included some Japanese Canadian elders from the families that lived in New Denver. And it produces different discussions, very, very interesting discussions about what the work is about, what the experiences were. Oftentimes, people who help out aren't very well versed in what happened during the war, what precipitated the internment. So at the Royal Ontario Museum, I got to participate in a show with other Japanese Canadian artists, which is a really interesting process again. And once more, we had a series of volunteers from around the gallery. Most recently, before Inheritance, it was shown at the Military Museum in Calgary in 2020, which was the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And it was shown with photographs and artifacts that contextualized the internment. So what you see here in the left vitrines are actually objects from my family that came through the war. Clearly, there aren't too many. You were allowed a maximum of 200 pounds per person, but it was really whatever you could carry. So this is the show at the Founders, which had a lot of floor space, and I actually showed the maximum number, which is about 600 of the shacks at the same time. And now back to the AGA show. So I really want to thank the AGA curator Lindsay Sharman and Catherine Croston, and the staff and preparators. Without their help, I would have had nothing to show. And I'd like to thank you all for attending.
And we do have about 10 minutes for questions. So maybe I'll start off just to get things going. You mentioned in your introduction the question of rage and yelling, and then you never came back to it.
I didn't come back, did I? No.
No, you didn't. And so, and I can understand why. I mean, it's not always something that one is comfortable talking about, but I guess I just wonder growing up whether that was something that you felt from your grandparents and your parents, or whether that's something that you came to later when you began to do research.
It's something that I came to. I was always kind of surprised at how my grandparents basically sort of shrugged their shoulders. It's like it's something that happened, you know. I think my parents were, more angry about it. When I started to learn about the details of it, it just incensed me because it was everything that we're told shouldn't happen in Canadian society. It's like we're supposed to. I grew up in the era of all of the I hate to call it propaganda, but popularization of this idea of a cultural mosaic where everyone brings whatever their background is and is allowed to celebrate that, and it becomes part of the fabric of the society. That's what the official line I was hearing, and yet I heard this story that was basically their lives were taken away by a combination of racism and greed, and that made me personally really, really angry. It was difficult. I tried a couple of times to make work based around that feeling or that notion, and I never came up with anything that was. It was therapeutic for me, maybe, but not something that was relatable to anybody else.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that, and I think that the work in itself is quiet, right? It's not yelling, it's not loud, it's not in your face in that sense. Even in the addition of documents and photographs and some of the other iterations, the work itself is very quiet. And so I think that there's maybe do you think that's about emptiness and loss, perhaps, that you're trying to address?
It's part of it. It's sort of a grieving and a remembering of something bad that happened, so it's not forgotten. The intent, though, isn't that it's pointing fingers. Although, I definitely still do that. I mean, I point fingers at the BC Security Commission. It's one of those things. I'll point fingers at politicians, but for me, it's just trying to come up with a translation. I sort of use my grandmothers as a kind of example of how they conveyed that experience. It wasn't about blame. It was actually about this is something hard, really hard that happened to us. I think like my dad in some ways felt a little guilt about it because he told me once it was kind of like going to summer camp for several years. You
Mm.
know, you're a young fella and you're doing all these cool things and you have freedom that you maybe wouldn't have had if you lived downtown in Vancouver. Um, because no one was guarding them. The kids could wander off. They could go over to the next camp, and that sounds kind of idyllic. I think it wasn't for the parents who had to think, what's going to happen next, and they did. They had to start from scratch when they got out.
Yeah, and I think the difference being the parents understand economic loss, they understand the loss of community, um, they understand the fear of not knowing, of uncertainty, which children probably are protected from in some respects. We do have a question in the chat, and it is, thank you, Steve. Truly appreciate being invited to hear about your work. My question is, how do you communicate your feelings about this history, specifically with new generations? What do you want them to take away?
What do I want them to take away? It's like it's an acknowledgement of something wrong in the past. And when we see it about to be repeated, for instance, tar paper shacks haven't gone away. Refugee camps haven't gone away. Internment hasn't gone away. It's a repeated trope through multiple societies who style themselves as being, progressive, even, right? So I think the more that younger people understand about this, the better. So I mean, maybe art, visual art, is not the best soapbox, but it is part of that consciousness. I know with my own kids, we've talked about this. When I was a kid, the dinner table was not a place where that conversation happened, right? And I think in some ways it needs to be, right? Getting the stories from my parents, it was always a little bit offhand. There'd be a bit of a recollection at a particular moment, and they tell me about something. But it wasn't until later, as I got older, that I started to ask the questions myself. Um, so if there's a takeaway, it's to get people to ask questions, to not simply accept and to remember how things have gone in the past. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, there's no other questions, so I'm going to ask another one. I was interested in your comment about Arthur Nishimura and the question around Japanese aesthetics. And it's interesting that to me, there's a difference between aesthetics and histories or culture. And I think, so I'm interested in the work that you made, the waterfall work with the paper, and and the work that you've made subsequently. I mean, the relationship to Hokusai and some of the other works, whether it's about aesthetics or is it about culture?
In some ways, I feel rather divorced from Japanese culture. I mean, part of the fallout of the internment is a lot of people in my generation, we didn't learn to speak Japanese. There was a sort of suppression of your Japanese-ness. And I think part of that was the idea that you didn't want to stand out so you could be picked out of the crowd again, right? So a lot of the Japanese families after the war, they didn't settle in the same neighborhood. They spread out a bit. It's harder to hit us if we spread out a bit. So I feel that kind of a little bit of a separation between me and specifically Japanese culture. But I think that there's a kind of seeping in of Japanese aesthetics. I mean, you can't get rid of it in all of my experiences with my parents and my grandparents. There was something different about the way that they approached stuff, right? And what I started to do was to look at, okay, well, what are my influences? You know, is there something that's identifiably sort of Japanese in my aesthetics? And can I, through research, get back to, you know, where that comes from? Does that answer the question?
Um, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think the waterfall work reminds me of I don't know if you've ever seen those Japanese noodle fountains.
Yes.
But yes, right. It
Yeah.
reminds me
Yeah.
of the noodles coming down the trough in the water and the yeah.
Absolutely. Right. And there's these odd ways that it connects. I was also really interested in the fact that, you know, I can't read any of the articles about these things in Japanese. I have to read translations, and sometimes the translations are terrible. And I can tell just by reading them in English that they're bad. So I got interested in, you know, a translation as being the place where I lived, right? Like it's a
Mhm.
kind of a translation. Everything is secondhand. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it's you know not you know viable or valuable or anything like that. It's just it's translated.
Right. Mhm. Oh, it's 7 o'clock, so we should be wrapping up. But I'm going to ask you one more question before we do. There's something interesting to me in your fascination with boxes. And I think there's two, I mean, to me, it brings together the two influences, I think. I think the influence, I mean, obviously in Japanese culture, the box is a very, very important object. And there are boxes that are, you know, contain many things and are gifted. And, you know, the box is a important thing. But also, I know in your earlier work, Joseph Cornell has been an important influence. So there seems to be something between those two aesthetics that come together, I think, between Cornell and Japan and the box, and how the box can be both a moment in time, but in some of your other work, it becomes almost a narrative of time in a
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely. I mean, the box is the miniature for any space that can possibly exist. It could be a conceptual space, it could be an actual space, um, and it gives focus to whatever is placed within it. And I'm as interested in empty boxes. You know, Cornell was not someone who always jam packed everything into the box. And there always does seem to be a kind of a narrative strategy there. I like it to be a sort of an open-ended narrative that the viewer has to activate. They can basically enter that box or that conceptual space from any direction that they want to, right? And there's not a specific. Now, with the long boxes, though, there's this real insistence on reading it from left to right
Mhm.
or right to left, and tendency is left to right, which I found really interesting. It was almost more like reading a line of poetry that it had to actually go in that direction for it to make sense.
Hmm. Which is interesting considering in Japanese you read right to left.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's a kind of inversion in a sense, potentially an inversion in a sense. Although I think that we're so in the Western world, we're so ingrained to move left to right, kind of constantly. Yeah.
now, in when it's placed in an installation setting or when it's placed in the setting of an exhibition, oftentimes you can short circuit that because a particular room might rotate in right to left direction, and so when they appear to the right of a door in an exhibition, oftentimes they do get read
I
from
get
right to
excellent.
left.
Yeah. 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 Interesting. So maybe I'll ask one more time our audience if there are any questions you want to put up into the chat. And doesn't seem so. So anyway, Steve, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today. Oh, wait. Oh, thank you for attending, everyone. So we've got to thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to Steve for the work that you had in the exhibition and for sharing it with us today, and also sharing some of the previous work, which I think really gives us some background and insight into, you know, how your work is progressing, and that it in fact is not linear. In a way, it's circular and kind of repeats and returns. So it's really interesting to see that as well as in terms of an overall body of work.
Great, thank you all for coming.
Okay.
And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody, and have a good Monday evening.